He pointed at me and laughed. I had learned to swallow those laughs for years, but that night the sound felt like a knife. I was 29, living in a cramped studio above a laundromat, paying rent with tips that never seemed to add up, and I waited tables at a downtown bistro to keep a roof over my head. My name is Elena Cruz. I was a server for 7 years. What happened that night started as another shift, and what happened after changed everything in ways I could not have imagined. If you believe small voices can topple big ones, hit like now and stay until the end, because this does not end quietly. This will get ugly and then strangely beautiful. This is the story of the heartbreaking plea I made, of the undercover CEO who was in our dining room, and of how a single phone recording became a reckoning. I will walk you through every moment, so do not skip ahead. Every second matters. The tone is raw and intimate, but the consequences were public and real. I remember the linen scent of clean napkins as we opened, the clatter of plates like distant rain, and the bitter coffee that kept me awake before the shift. I remember my hands shaking as I folded menus, the fluorescent hum in the kitchen, and the faint city smoke drifting in through a cracked window. When I was a child, my mother worked 2 jobs, and my father left before I could remember his face. I learned early the taste of pennies and the way second-hand coats smelled of other winters. I grew up on the North Side, in an apartment where the radiator thumped like a tired heart, and dinner was often whatever was cheapest. School felt like a hallway to somewhere else, and I held tight to the idea that I would not ask for much, only stability. In high school, I took a hospitality class and found that I loved the choreography of service, the clink of glasses, the brief human dramas that unfolded over meals. College was not an option financially, so I trained on the job, sweeping tables under the judgmental gaze of shift managers, learning to read faces the way others read books. Losing my mother to illness when I was 19 hardened me in some ways and softened me in others. Grief taught me to listen closely to people, because everyone carries something invisible. In the years after, I became a lead server, taking late shifts, saving what I could, sending money when still necessary, and always making sure customers felt seen, even when my own life felt invisible. I kept the same scar on my knuckle from a broken glass when I was 23 as a quiet reminder that pain heals but leaves a line. Before the incident, the bistro had a reputation for elegant plating and brusque service. The dining room was narrow and warm, with Edison bulbs, varnished wood tables, and a long bar that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Staff included my manager Frank Morales, who handled reservations with a dry laugh, our head chef Luis Ortega, who moved like a conductor through heat and steam, bartender Leo Rivera, who always had a joke and a rag in his back pocket, hostess Maria Gomez, who greeted regulars like family, pastry chef Naomi Chen, who dusted sugar like snow, busser Jamal King, who always hummed while he worked, and line cook Rosa Alvarez, who could make chili that tasted like home. The night began with the chatter of regulars, the metallic tinkle of cutlery, and the low thud of a delivery truck outside. An expensive car pulled up, and a table of 4 was seated near the window. They smelled of new cologne and expensive leather. The man, I later learned, was an undercover CEO named Jonathan Hale, arrived with a confident step, but sat back like any other guest and watched. He wore no name tag. He ordered without glancing at the menu. His phone sat face up, and he sipped water with the patience of someone used to power. The restaurant filled with the murmurs of diners, the hiss of the espresso machine, the buttery aroma from the oven, the cool touch of linen sleeves on exposed arms, and the metallic taste of anticipation in my mouth as I prepared to take their order. The immediate pressure was the bill I had been carrying home each month. Rent notices had started arriving in bright envelopes. The electric bill had a red number that made my chest tighten, and my car needed brakes I could not afford. I had a plan to move to a different neighborhood, but the deposit was a faraway number in a bank account I could not reach. 1 week before the incident, I opened an eviction notice and folded it so I could hide it in my apron. The fear of losing the little stability I had was constant. The stakes were everything. I remembered the texture of the paper as I cradled it in my hand, the way the fluorescent light above the host stand magnified the black letters, the metallic taste of panic, the constant background thrum of the kitchen, and the way my chest felt like a drum. I told no one because pride and pride again made me pretend I was fine. But every time I smiled at a table, I was bargaining with fate. That is the pressure that made my plea that night feel like a desperation that could either make me invisible or make me heard. The arrival of the antagonist that night felt like the swell before a storm. The table of 4 included a man who seemed to own the room, not because he spoke loudly, but because the air bent around him. He was flanked by a younger man and a teenage boy who avoided eye contact. The boy was
named Aaron, according to the reservation, and he wore a hearing aid. I noticed him because he watched the world with intense eyes and clutched a well-worn comic book. When the man at the head of the table, who later was identified as someone with influence and wealth, made a comment about the noise and snapped a sharp word at Aaron, the room cooled. He made a mocking gesture at the boy, which sent a wave of heat to my face. He told his group to ignore Aaron and called for service like a demand. "We do not need to accommodate this," he said with a laugh that had ice in it. I heard that laugh as if underwater. Maria, the hostess, watched from the podium, her hands gripping a clipboard. Frank, the manager, ducked into the office, and Naomi paused with a tray balanced like a sun. I heard the scrape of a chair, the scent of lemon from the bar, the coarse feel of the menu under my fingers, the low buzz of conversation like bees, and the distant hiss of a fryer. The man ordered in a tone that implied he could buy the place. On the table, a glass tumbled, and the sound seemed to mark the beginning of the public humiliation. Aaron was ignored and then mocked. The way his hearing aid caught the light made me angry in a way I had not felt in years. Moment of tension 1 arrived when the man laughed at Aaron and told him to sit quietly like a display. I walked over and said, "Can I get him anything? Water? A noise-friendly corner?" He scoffed and said, "No special treatment. We are not running a charity here." I replied, "He is a customer like anyone else. He deserves basic respect." He leaned back and said, "I do not pay to be lectured by servers." My heart pounded as the dining room watched. Maria shifted her weight. Jamal stopped clearing plates. Naomi's spoon paused mid-stir. I felt the heat of the lamp on my neck, smelled the citrus on the bartender's towel, tasted the salt on my own lower lip, and the floor felt slightly sticky under my shoes. The man raised his voice and said, "Who are you to tell me about manners?" I said, "I am the person who serves people. I ask you to show common decency." He smiled like a predator. The teenage boy flinched. The room held its breath. I felt the sting behind my eyes and the ache of years of swallowing. I made a choice that was small in sound but large in risk. I walked away to the computer to print the check, and my hand trembled as I reached for the printer. The video started with a quiet capture on someone's wrist, as if it were nervous. A patron named Sarah Mitchell pulled out her phone. She did not intend to go viral. She just wanted evidence because she knew what happened to people who were humiliated. Within minutes, snippets of audio and the phrase, "Will you stop?" circulated in a text thread. At this point, I want to pause and ask you a question. Have you ever felt like you had to speak up even though it might cost you everything? Share in the comments one sentence starting with "I would have" or "I did" and tell us what you felt. Your comments matter and they help others feel less alone. If you have a similar story, write one line and tag someone who should hear it. This community is a place for support and to amplify voices that were dismissed. By commenting, you help create a record and show people they are not alone. Now back to the story because the next moments are where things change.
Moment of tension, too, came when I stepped in front of the table and spoke for Aaron in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness. The man accused me of overstepping and raised his elbow as if to emphasize his wealth. "She thinks she speaks for people," he said, loud enough for people 2 tables away to notice. I answered, "I speak for respect. Your presence does not cancel someone else's dignity." He barked a laugh and said, "You are a server. You are biased." I said, "Being a server does not make me invisible. It makes me see people as they are." People near the window hushed. Leo, the bartender, set down his shaker. Frank came out of the office with a company brochure in his hand like a shield. I could hear the clink of silverware as forks paused above plates. I could smell the garlic from a nearby table, the sugar from a dessert plate, the faint sweat of a crowded room. A woman at the bar whispered, "Good for you," and a man in a suit filmed from his phone. The man's face changed from amusement to irritation. He tapped his glass and said, "Do you want me to leave?" I said, "No, I want you to see how you speak to another human." He scoffed, and then, in a move that stunned everyone, he told his companions to stand, and they left with a flurry of coats and a crunch of gravel outside. The teenage boy stayed for a moment and then followed them. I felt my knees go weak and the air tasted like copper. The confrontation proper unfolded with a dozen exchanges that made the dining room electric. After the group left, a hush fell like fog. The Undercover CEO, Jonathan Hale, who had been at a different table, had been watching. He called over Frank and then asked for me by name in a quiet voice that did not carry entitlement but curiosity. "Are you Elena?" he asked. I said yes. He said, "I recorded the interaction." I asked, "Why?" He said, "Because I do undercover work."
To see how companies treat people. I blinked because the phrase undercover sounded theatrical and his eyes were steady. He asked, "Was Aaron being treated poorly?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you speak up?" I said, "Because if no one says anything, we normalize cruelty." He listened, and then he asked, "Do you want this escalated?" I answered, "I want accountability." He said, "I can help. I have resources." The exchange continued with him asking questions and me bluntly naming the immediate need for both apology and structural change in training. We spoke about the manager Frank, about policies, and about how often staff saw disrespect go unchallenged. The conversation was punctuated by Frank interjecting with defensive murmurs, by Naomi whispering that she had seen worse, by Jamal saying quietly that he wanted to feel safe at work, and by Rosa adding that tips had fallen when certain regulars clung to bad behavior. The room was full of low sounds and close eyes. The smell of lemon returned as the bartender wiped down the counter. Behind the scenes, Leo slipped a USB drive into his pocket because he sensed this might need evidence. Moment of tension 3 was public and immediate. Jonathan asked to see how management handled complaints later that week and then revealed his identity to a camera crew from a local network, a producer named Aisha Kim who had been tipped by an intern Emily Park who worked in PR. We recorded training sessions, and when the footage of the original incident was played at a company meeting, the reaction was explosive. Frank tried to defend himself, and the company sent a statement that sounded rehearsed and stale. A representative from the employment board, Officer Daniels, called to say they would open an inquiry. A lawyer named Mark Delgado offered to look at potential violations. The powerful man who had left in a huff was identified by a guest named Peter Wallace, who recognized him as someone with multiple board seats. That public moment had the bitter smell of burned coffee and the sharp taste of vindication. Comments on social media were instantaneous. People posted clips and shared the plea for accountability. Naomi cried in the kitchen, and Jamal pounded a fist into a towel. The noise of the online world was a new sound, like raw electricity. Corporations named and shamed began to feel pressure. This is where the story turned from a personal plea into a public reckoning. As the footage spread, named individuals and institutions began to act. Sarah Mitchell uploaded the clip and tagged a community podcast. The episode was picked up by the River City Gazette, run by editor Hannah Cole, who wrote an op-ed and linked the video. Within 48 hours, the bistro had messages of support from local nonprofit the Inclusion Alliance, from the city council member Raul Ortega, who promised an inquiry, and from a tech company run by CEO Jonathan Hale, who initiated an internal review with help from lawyer Mark Delgado. The restaurant lost 2 corporate bookings after a sponsor, Paulson Foods, pulled their catering contract. A petition started by Maria Gomez and shared by Naomi gathered signatures. An online fundraiser began on the platform Give Together and was organized by Emily Park, who had experience in digital campaigns. Jamal, Rosa, Leo, Naomi, Maria, and a growing number of patrons posted testimonials naming patterns of disrespect. The narrative shifted from one insult to a pattern of systemic neglect. The man who had mocked Aaron issued a statement through his spokesperson Cara Levin that said he was sorry if anyone was offended and that he would engage in sensitivity training. The apology felt thin. But the pressure mounted. Shares, comments, and calls filled inboxes. The restaurant had to respond publicly, and the owner, Frank Morales, found himself in a position he had never imagined when he walked into a camera-filled lobby. The story had momentum because the evidence was tangible, and the community would not let it be shrugged away. In the weeks that followed, offers came in that I could not have dreamed of. Jonathan Hale connected me with a legal aid fund and with an employment coach named Teresa Alvarez, who helped me draft a plan. Naomi was offered a position at a pastry shop in another neighborhood, run by chef Ingrid Park, who had seen her talent. Jamal was approached by a community center to run a youth culinary class. Sarah Mitchell became a vocal advocate and did an interview with Aisha Kim for a local show. Officer Daniels met with the Inclusion nonprofit. Mark Delgado agreed to consult pro bono on workplace policy. Frank Morales faced a formal complaint and agreed to review the restaurant protocol publicly for transparency. The network attention brought both scrutiny and opportunities. I was offered a small fellowship to speak about frontline worker rights and a temporary stipend that helped me keep my apartment. The public reaction showed me that collective action could translate into immediate relief. But it also exposed me to trolling and to people who sought to discredit my motives. I had to learn boundaries quickly and rely on friends who, named earlier, were there to support me when the noise felt too loud. The following month, one of the most concrete changes occurred when the corporate client Paulson Foods announced they were pausing all catering contracts nationwide with the bistro chain pending an investigation. The chain voluntarily closed for 2 days for mandatory sensitivity training led by Inclusion Alliance with funding from Jonathan Hale's Foundation. City Council member Raul Ortega issued a statement praising the staff for bravery and announced a task force to examine customer interaction policies in hospitality. The Give Together campaign reached its target and raised $35,000 that was distributed among affected staff to cover lost tips while the business adjusted. The press named our server Elena Cruz and featured Aaron, who was now represented by an advocate named Dr. Miriam Lowe. The immediate result was a public apology from the customer who made the comment and a statement from Frank Morales promising revised training modules and a clear reporting pathway. The smell of fresh paint from an updated bulletin board in the staff room felt like a new start. There were meetings with HR and with legal to draft a complaint protocol that included anonymous reporting and immediate temporary reassignment for staff who preferred it. The community support was tangible and scary, and it changed the calculus of power. People began to reach out to me asking how to start similar movements in their own towns, and I found myself answering emails late into the night, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline and hope. 3 months later, the pattern consolidated. The chain had retained Mark Delgado's firm to oversee a comprehensive audit of customer conduct and staff safety. The audit found lapses in reporting and unclear escalation procedures and recommended a mandatory training schedule, a publicly accessible code of conduct, and financial support for staff affected by incidents. Frank Morales took a leave to attend management training, and 2 branch managers were reassigned after staff feedback. Jonathan Hale's foundation partnered with the Inclusion Alliance and pledged a seed grant of $100,000 to fund community training initiatives and to create a small emergency relief fund for hospitality workers. The local press ran follow-ups, and the story was now used as a case study in a hospitality management course at Midtown College, where Professor Elena White used our case to teach students about ethics. The bistro chain reported a temporary drop in bookings, but an increase in applications once their new policy was public, showing that transparency sometimes attracts rather than repels talent. Aaron became an advocate for accessibility and spoke at a community forum with Dr. Miriam Lowe, and Jamal began teaching a youth class that included service training with empathy modules. The staff had regular counseling sessions funded by the grant, and Naomi accepted the pastry shop role while continuing to consult on training modules for our chain. The public reaction mellowed into a steady drumbeat of accountability rather than instantaneous outrage. We learned how to sustain change beyond the viral spike. 6 months later, the transformation felt structural. The chain released an annual report detailing policy changes and the creation of a permanent inclusion officer role filled by someone recommended by the Inclusion Alliance. Paulson Foods resumed selective partnerships with branches that met compliance standards and required vendors to sign conduct agreements. The emergency fund had grown to $75,000 through corporate matches and community donations, and had helped 10 workers with housing or medical bills since its creation. A class action inquiry led by attorney Mark Delgado and filed by a coalition of hospitality workers prompted the company to settle on revised terms that included pay for employees who missed shifts due to incidents and a clearer
Path for discipline when customers violated conduct policies. Frank Morales returned to a new position focused on staff development, or he resigned, depending on the branch, where his name remained controversial. The region saw a measurable uptick in employee retention in the hospitality sector, and local job listings emphasized training and respect as core values. Aaron started a small advocacy group for accessibility in schools and businesses, and had become a local voice for inclusive practice. My life shifted too. I took a short fellowship to speak on panels about worker dignity, and used the stipend to move into a slightly larger apartment with windows that open to sunlight. I still wear the same scar on my knuckle, but its meaning changed from a mark of survival to a mark of a story told. The ripple effect was not perfection. Some people remained defensive, and some corporations issued statements without real change. But the combination of community pressure, named accountability, legal advocacy, and targeted funding created a pattern that outlasted a single viral clip. In the end, the plea I made that night was heartbreaking, because it was honest and small, and because it cut through years of normalized neglect. It was also the seed of something larger, because people refused to let it be dismissed. The man who mocked Aaron faced reputational harm and a loss of social standing in certain circles. The bistro chain paid a cost in contracts and had to rebuild trust. The tangible outcomes included a pause on 2 major contracts, the creation of an emergency fund, mandatory training modules adopted chain-wide, counseling resources for staff, and a local policy task force. The universal lesson was clear. A single voice can catalyze structural change when supported by community, documentation, and institutions willing to act. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share so more people hear how empathy and resilience can alter the balance between status and justice.